welcome to this watercolor techniques video for Patreon. And we're going to talk about a lot of things today about the properties of watercolor paints. And we've done a lot of work with color. We've done our color wheel and our color charts and complementary tertiaries. We've learned how to mix those beautiful neutrals with our split primary palette. But as we progress with our watercolor, there's a big wide world out there of color to choose from. And while I have selected the split primaries with all of the things we're going to talk about today in mind, when you go out and you start to shop for watercolors and purchase pigments, you want to make sure you understand what you're buying, because there's a wide variety of things out there, many brands, many types of watercolor paint, and they all have the same core properties that we want to look for when we're purchasing them. And these things really affect the way they work for us, how easy they are to work with, but they also affect our work after it's done. And if you ever come to the point, and you will, if you keep doing it, you will, but if you want to frame something or even sell something, these things are really important to consider, especially when we sell them to someone else. Because when I create a watercolor painting and I sell it to someone, I want it to stand the test of time. I want it to be the highest quality product I can possibly make. And a lot of that depends on my materials that I choose to use to create it with. So these things will help us in all of those ways. They'll help us work with watercolor better, make better selections when we purchase them, and they'll help our work stand the test of time, okay, when we choose to frame or sell them. So to start, I printed out this book from WindsorNewton.com. And Winsor & Newton, as you probably know, is a very, very fine traditional watercolor paint made in England. They've been made since the 1800s, and many, many artists use them as their core watercolors for professional work. They're an industry standard. They're just wonderful paints. And so I printed out this book. You can print it out too. It's an excellent resource, not just for their paint, but for other paints. And I just want to go through it and show you the things that they've included in this book about watercolor paint. So they start out with a little bit of history. We don't need to go into that. And how they formulate their paints, okay? And the type of binders that they use. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is really, really important. And different manufacturers use different binders, and there are many good ones, okay? But there are also some that aren't quite as effective. And it's important, we don't need to know necessarily what binder a paint manufacturer is using, but we can tell a lot by what they tell us about their binders. And also when we do our experimenting with different watercolors, we can tell a lot about the binder. They talk about the pigments, the types of pigments, they're inorganic and organic, single pigments and mixed pigments. All of these things are interesting to know. But the only thing that I really am concerned with is if it's a single pigment or a mixed pigment. And I tend to call a mixed pigment a compound pigment. And all that means is that there's more than one. And typically, when there's more than one, it's going to be a color that could produce muddy mixes if not mixed properly. So it's a good thing to know. But another good thing to know is that there are some pigments, single pigments, that cannot be reproduced by mixing. They give the example of cobalt violet, which is number A here. Okay, it's a very bright, clean, pinky violet, and you cannot mix this color no matter how hard you try. So that's good to know as well, because there are some pigments, if we want a color like this, we're going to have to buy the single pigment paint because they're impossible to mix. Okay? So they show here a range of blues, and blues are also very tricky to make, although you can make some of these by starting with either a warm blue or a cool blue, as you've seen in our color mixing. We can change blue, but there are pigments, like it's impossible to mix a true blue. It's just, out of other colors. You have to start with a blue somewhere. I hope that makes sense. So the next page, they talk about pigment family groups. And this is really interesting to talk about, the earth pigments and the synthetic earths, the cadmium pigments, alternatives to cadmium pigments, because cadmium pigments are toxic and they can be harmful to you and to the environment. They're safe to use if you use them properly and you dispose of them properly. But personally, I choose to stay away from them and use alternatives. They also talk about the quinacridone colors, which are really, really prevalent in modern watercolor pigments. Very, very safe, very transparent, and very, very light fast. So here is the page that we really need to talk about. And this is the page about handling properties. And I'm going to move this aside and I'm going to show you some of these things as I go through this list. So what they talk about here is transparency and opacity, granulation, staining and lifting on this page. So I'm going to show you some of that. So I have here my Strathmore watercolor sketchbook, and I just made a little black line with a permanent black marker. And I'm going to show you two things. This is our Daniel Smith palette, and I'm going to just use the Cool Red, which is quinacridone rose, and just paint a swatch over this black line. And you can see how the black line just shines right through. Nothing is impeding it. So this color is very transparent, okay? However, there are many mass-produced watercolors and handmade watercolors that are opaque. Also really wonderful to work with, okay, when we're building on our palette. But there is a difference, and I'm going to show you, for instance, let's see here, a good one to choose. So this yellow is made by Stoneworks Mill. It's one of my favorites. It's called Solstice. And if I paint Solstice over this black line, do you see how it stays on top of the black line? That is opacity. Okay, that means that if you put this color at full strength over another color, it's going to somewhat hide it. Now, if I take Solstice and I add plenty of water to it, plenty of water, so I'm making a lighter value by adding water, and I paint it over the black line, the lighter value disappears. So you can make opaque watercolors more transparent, but by adding water, but they're also going to become lighter in value. So that's another important thing to talk about here. In watercolor, water is our white pigment. So if you were painting with acrylics or oils or gouache, mostly acrylics and oils, if you want to make a color lighter in value, you're going to add white to it, okay? In watercolor, we don't do that. We use more water. So water is our friend. Water does a lot of things. If I put water down on a paper and I put down some pigment, okay, it's going to help the pigment disperse and move around, all right? If I just used a very dry brush and picked up pigment with a dry brush, I'll just use the same pigment, and I put it down, it's not going to work as well. Okay, we need water with watercolor. We need a lot of water, okay? Even if we want to make something very, very dark in value, we still need a lot of water. It's what helps it disperse, okay? And gives us the qualities that we look for when we're using watercolor paint. And it also helps us create lighter values. So whether it's light or dark, we need water to do that, all right? More water for lighter shades, less water, but still enough to make it fluid for darker shades, all right? Okay, so another thing that this talks about is granulation. And I want to say too about transparency. The split primary pigments that we're using are very, very transparent colors, and that means that they're going to be easier to use as a mixing palette. There's less of a chance that you'll create muddy colors, okay? So that's why we choose the transparency in our split primaries. In our other colors that we add to our palette, this doesn't matter so much, okay? So the next thing I want to talk about is granulation. And I'm going to swatch out here some French ultramarine blue, which is the only blue, the only color that granulates in our split primary palette. If I put this French ultramarine blue down, as it dries, you'll notice it starts to get kind of speckled and mottled, and it will tend to separate itself from other colors. To me, this is a very desirable effect, okay? But there are some people who don't like granulation. They want their colors to be very smooth. So if you don't, you need to be aware of that. But you also need to be aware of it if you want to add texture. So if I'm using handmade paint, let's say this Ursa, okay, this also has a lot of granulation in it, a lot. All right, it's a very desirable property. And what granulation is when the pigments are milled and then bound into a binder and made into watercolor, some of those pigment particles are heavier than others and bigger than others. So when the paint is added to water and put on paper, the heavier pigments will settle into the paper and create that effect of granulation. A color like, grabbed the wrong one. A color like phthalo blue green shade is very smooth. It does not have granulation. So when this dries, it will be very smooth. Okay, it might show the texture of the paper, but it's not going to separate into all these different particles. All right, and it typically won't separate from mixes. All right, if you use colors that are heavily granulating, like French ultramarine blue, the pigments will tend to separate out. All right, so that's granulation. So there's also something called staining, and typically colors that granulate do not stain. So I can go back into French ultramarine blue and I can lift it out almost entirely, okay? Phthalo blue is a little bit different. When it's still really wet like this, I can lift it out. But as it dries, it's going to be harder and harder because that phthalo blue pigment will stain the paper, okay? So once it dries, it's much harder to lift. And that's just something we need to know. If you're painting something, let's say you're painting an autumn leaf, and you want to go back in and you want to lift out tiny little veins, lines for veins, you won't be able to do that as easily with a staining color. All right? So that's staining and lifting and granulation. So the next page is about the role and importance of permanence. Okay, and they're definite. They use Opera Rose as an example, and Opera Rose is a really good example of permanence. Also, alizarin crimson, which is a very, very popular color. So another word for permanence is light fastness, or the light fast rating. Typically, pigments that are earth-based and mineral-based are very, very light fast. They will stand the test of time. And we know this from doing light fast testing ourselves, but also because we can look at paintings that were made in the 1700s and 1800s, and we can see how certain pigments have disappeared from the painting over time. Turner's paintings are a prime example of this, okay? When he used pigments such as aureolin or rose madder genuine or alizarin crimson, those pigments have disappeared from his paintings over time. When we are making something to sell to someone, we don't want that to happen. So light fast rating is really, really important. And when you're purchasing watercolors that are mass-produced, traditionally made watercolors like Winsor & Newton or Daniel Smith, the light fast rating will always be on the tube, and it says it right here, light fastness 1. 1 is the strongest. That means it will not ever go away. It's permanent. Quinacridone rose, if I look here, light fastness 1. So all of our split primary colors are light fastness 1. I've made sure of that, okay? However, when you're buying, and any manufacturer that mass produces paints will list that on their tube. They have to. All right, so you can always look at the tube and see what the light fast rating is. Opera Rose has a light fast rating of 4. It's the most fugitive. Okay, that means it will disappear over time. The reason why is because Opera Rose is made from a dye and not a pigment. So many of the paints that you'll find that have a very poor light fast rating, they are made from dyes, okay? And that's why student grade watercolors, which are often made from dyes or lower quality pigments don't have as high of a light fast rating. Not all of them, but you need to be aware of it. Okay? So light fast rating is really, really important. Many handmade watercolor makers, the makers who make handmade watercolors, do their own light fast testing, and they also rely on the company that they buy the pigments from to list the light fast rating of that pigment. However, my feeling is it's up to the artist. Okay, so if you are going to buy a new set of paints, I highly recommend you do a light fast test and just do it for a month or two. And you swatch out your colors on a piece of paper, all right, and then you cut each strip of those colors in half. Put half of them in a sunny window for at least a month, a very sunny window in bright sun, and keep half of them in a drawer. And then at the end of the month, put them back together and see if they have changed at all. If they haven't changed at all in bright sun in a month or so, then it's pretty safe to assume that you can use them in your paintings. Okay? Now, if we're the type of painter who is painting for process only and in a bound sketchbook where the paintings are never going to be in the sun, you know, those kinds of things, light fastness doesn't really matter. All right, it doesn't really matter. But if you are going to frame your paintings or you are going to be selling them, it is very, very important to know that you're using paints that are light fast. All right? So that's light fast. Then they go into color mixing, which is really interesting. They talk about the 6 color mixing system. Theirs is a little different than mine, but it's very similar. They talk about mediums and accessories. And then they give you a wonderful color chart that lists the pigment number and if it's opaque or transparent and if it's light fast or not. And so you can tell which ones are the single pigments, which ones are the compound pigments, and it's got a key so you can see everything. All right? Okay. And then they give lists of their transparent colors, their opaque colors, their warm and cool colors, which is really handy, and the colors that granulate. So if you're going to use Winsor & Newton paint, this is really a great tool to have. Then they go into colors that they've modified or discontinued. It's got a lot of information, and I highly recommend if you're going to get a mass-produced watercolor like this, that you download this information from their website. It's fabulous. Now, almost all of the manufacturers like that, like Daniel Smith and Holbein and Sennelier, they all have these that you can download on their website. All right? So that's a handy thing. And it also teaches us, even if we're not using these watercolors, it teaches us a lot about the properties of watercolors. So I want to talk about a couple more things. I showed you these beautiful transparent Daniel Smith colors. Winsor & Newton are also beautiful. These, however, are a very, very expensive watercolor called Old Holland. And I bought them recently because I really wanted to try them. And what I noticed is that there's way too much binder in these paints. So no matter what I do, I'm mostly getting binder. All right, and the paints go on very streaky. So you'll notice that they look like, they look syrupy when they come out of the tube. Okay, and they're pretty, they're really pretty, and I want to work with them a little bit more. But you have to be aware that while binder is a really good thing, you can also use too much of it. All right, so as they have sat here and dried and I mixed them in with their binder a little bit, they're a little bit easier to use. But when they first came out of this, out of the tube, they were almost impossible to use right out of the tube. I had to mix them and let them sit for a while to harden. So just be aware when you squeeze watercolor out of a tube and you get a big gloop of like clear honey looking liquid, that is binder, and you want to mix that back into the watercolor. You can massage the tube a little bit. You could squeeze out a bunch and mix it into a pan, but you don't want to use it when it's really sticky and separated like that. Okay? So the other thing I wanted to talk about is I wanted to talk about binder again and the way binder adheres paint to the paper, and that's why we use them. We need our pigments bound to the paper we're using. All right. Binder also helps things disperse. So a lot of paint makers will use glycerin or honey. Honey as a humectant and glycerin as a dispersal. Some will use oxgall. I mean, they have all different types that they use. But the thing is when they're made, they need to be permanent on the page. If we're going to sell something, if we're just painting for fun and for our own process and enjoyment, these things don't matter as much, okay? So you can see if I start rubbing on these paints that are already dry, nothing happens to them. They're going to be pretty permanent. I've never ever seen a paint made by like Winsor Newton or Daniel Smith or whatever that start to come off the page. However, if we re-wet them and we take a wet brush into them, you know, this is a staining color, so it's not going to lift as much. But ultramarine is not. And so I can still push it around if I need to. All right, that's different. What I'm talking about is when your painting is dry, okay, and you start to rub. This one's Stoneworks Mill, a handmade watercolor. It doesn't move at all. But there are some pigments, especially the gemstones, that do tend to move on paper. So like this one here is totally dry, and if I push my finger over it, it comes off the paper, which is okay. All right. But if I'm selling something and I take it to my framer, to the gallery, and they will clean this painting off. And if things start coming off, they're going to be angry at me. So when I'm creating something that is for sale, I have to do these tests on my paints to make sure that they don't come off. If they do come off, I can add a little binder to them and let them dry, and then look, it doesn't move anymore. Okay, it doesn't move anymore. So you can always add binder to paints like that. This is another gemstone paint that has a proper binder, and no matter how hard I rub on it, it doesn't come off the paper. All right, so those are important things to know if you're going to sell your work. All right. Okay, so those are the properties of watercolor. So before we close, I want to show you one more thing. And that, again, is about water to paint ratio. And I'm going to use these paints from Stoneworks Mill. So let's say this color. This color is called Strata, and it's a really deep brown. All right, it's got some mica in it, so it has a little bit of shimmer. It has beautiful granulation, and it's very deep. So I can use the paint very, very dark, still with water in it. Okay, it still has water. I can use the paint with a really dry brush, and it's not going to have the same effect. I'll get it to be really dark, but it's not going to move on the paper, all right? And then I can add, if I wanted a lighter version of this, I can add a lot of water. So I'm going to take some on my palette and add quite a bit of water to it and paint it out. And now I get a more transparent and lighter in value version of this color. These are important things to know. Okay, so water is our friend. We need to use enough water. If I don't use enough water, I'm going to get this streaking. Okay, sometimes that might be a technique you want to use. If you're doing dry brush and you're doing maybe some water or something and you want to skip across the paper so you get sparkles and highlights in the water, that's a technique. Okay, but unless you're doing something specific like this, it's going to be really difficult to get the effects you want unless you use plenty of water. Let me show you another color. This is ultramarine blue. So if I use it straight from the pan with a wet brush, I get a really, almost at its full value. Okay, but as I add water to it, it's going to make it lighter. And I can get this really light, transparent blue. So lots of water is a necessity for watercolor. All right, we use more when we want to make it paler. We use a little bit less when we want to make it darker. But without it, it's not going to give us that whoosh and mix and mingle and dispersion on our paper that we need. All right? So I hope this was helpful. I wanted to go over these things because you're going to get to a point where you want to use more than your split primaries. I'm sure you're already there. And it's important to make informed decisions when we buy our paint. Paint is expensive, and we want paint that will work for us and work for our purposes. So again, these things are extra, extra important if your plan is to make work to sell to others. It's very, very important. Or to frame for your own home. All right, it's also very, very important to give as gifts that people might frame, because we want our work to stand the test of time. All right, that's it for today for our watercolor techniques. I will see you next week. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will be here to answer questions as always. So feel free to ask me anything about this video or any of the other ones, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Take care.